Okay, welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stand. Today we're doing Israel Adesanya's training camp ahead of his up-and-coming fight on February the 1st. Remember, this series is always about just looking at the best things that we can take from this and see what you can look at for your own training, give you some ideas on how you can improve your own aspects. Remember, it's never an attack on the athlete or the coaches. Don't really want to focus on any particularly negative stuff. It's just not that nice, to be honest, to make content like that, and we don't really want to make that style of content at Sika Strength. So we're looking at the good stuff here that you can take from this, apply to your own training, and hopefully improve in certain areas. Now, the first up we've got is some conditioning. So let's take a look at the conditioning piece first.
It's, again, growth from the coaches instead of just going full old school. We're using science-based training now. And when it's time to put our foot on the gas, we fucking just blast through it, work. Really maximize those moments, chase the red, because that's where adaptation is. For me, it's about me and just improving and really showing what I can really do in the full range of mixed martial arts. Yeah, the last two opponents, it was personal in a way because they try to attack my character. I'm so far removed from it now. I'm like, bro, you don't even know me. You just don't take it personally. It's like, okay, it's a fight. Yeah, I don't need all that shit anymore. But you'll see, it's easier said than done. Like, the hands will talk.
Push. Let's go. Nice.
Okay, so first up, we've got this conditioning piece here. We've got a really large circuit style training, and this is a really common favorite that we see among mixed martial art athletes. And with good reason, when you're in camp and when you're coming up to a fight, one of your main priorities for your strength conditioning work is always going to be your conditioning. Conditioning is the main aim when it comes to this block of training, or one of the larger aims that we're going to be trying to improving, and that is your conditioning for your sport-specific activity. Now, this conditioning bout has a couple of different aspects. It's got squat jumps, battle ropes, striking, and an assault bike. Now, the assault bike is one of our favorite pieces of conditioning equipment that we use with different combat sports athletes, whether that's jiu-jitsu or judo, mixed martial arts, kickboxing, whatever it is. The assault bike is incredibly useful. It's really useful for a couple of reasons. One, it requires absolutely zero technique. You cannot mess up the technique of an assault bike. If you're using your legs and you're using your arms, you are going to be able to execute the assault bike technique correctly. It's really beneficial because we can get a lot of conditioning done in a really short amount of time. It doesn't put you in any strange positions. It doesn't put you in any cramped positions. You know, if you look at the rower, for example, sometimes this can be uncomfortable on people's lower backs. A ski erg, for example, requires a surprising amount of technique to be efficient with it. But the assault bike, you can go on an assault bike having never used it before and have an incredibly productive conditioning session. You go ham on the assault bike and it is so useful. The other aspect that we would look at when we're using conditioning that would be parallel to the assault bike when it comes to combat sports athletes is generally 400 meter repeats. So if you're looking for one or two things to really narrow down your focus on for your conditioning, for your combat sports, it is the assault bike, and running repeats, generally about 400 meters, are fantastic conditioning tools. Now, one thing you do need to think about here in this circuit style training is your technique, and your technique under fatigue. So for someone like Israel, realistically, he is not really concerned about seeing a deterioration of his technique long term. So when you're in a high intensity bout like this, you're doing a lot of conditioning, you're hitting the heavy bag, you're kicking, you're striking, your technique and power are going to be reduced. You're probably going to be having some, let's say, faulty or poor motor patterns. You're going to regress to secondary positions or striking that you wouldn't necessarily use in an actual combat scenario in your sport-specific activities. But for someone like Israel, this doesn't really matter. But for someone who's not as an elite level athlete, someone who's not as fine-tuned, as experienced as this, I would caution you in being a little bit more precise with where you would do this style of conditioning and what you add in here. So there's some benefit, of course, to practicing under duress. And so if you can ensure that your technique stays high, you stay precise, and you're executing a strike or a kick or a takedown like you would want to, or as close as you can get to during your actual fights or your matches during these conditioning pieces, then it's great. But if you find yourself deteriorating really rapidly, executing punches or kicks that are just not what you or your coach wants, I would be cautious. So again, for someone like Israel, Israel, probably a non-factor. I don't really think it's a major concern for him. But if you're doing these style of conditioning bouts, just be cautious of the impact of fatigue on your technique, which some scenarios can be useful, but often it can be largely negative, and you're really muddying the waters of your quality of technique.
This guy again. Oh, come on. What a waste of focus.
Okay, so next up we can see him in between his sessions. So in the morning he had his conditioning session. Later that evening then he has his strength training session, and then he said as a wrestling specific practice session. So in between this we can see him wearing something you've probably seen a lot of different athletes wearing, and that is these large pneumatic boots. Often the Normatec ones, I think, are the leading brand who make these. You might have wondered what they do, and the idea is that it is passive recovery or active recovery while you're being passive. So you're sitting there, and their claim, and it seems to be somewhat substantiated, is it clears blood lactate faster than just sitting there not wearing the boots. So if we compare this, if we looked at this versus active recovery and then the Normatec boots and then sitting there doing absolutely nothing, it does seem that active recovery and maybe the use in a separate group, the use of Normatec boots clear that blood lactate. The real question is though, is this useful? And if we look at this in groups which repeat effort testing, if they test the vertical jump or the squat or something, or their conditioning bouts a day later or 2 days later, when we look at these different groups, you don't really see any difference in the actual recovery of these athletes. The ability to perform these tasks isn't changed regardless of what group they put themselves in. And this is something we've talked about a lot in regards to the words we use and what we think we're getting out of them. When we look at active recovery or passive recovery, we assume we're going to be recovered faster, and then we'll display this when we go back to our activity. So the idea would be if you'd use the Normatec boots, or maybe the implication is that you would use boots like this, pneumatic boots, and then you would go and do your activity and you would be more recovered than if you hadn't used them. But it doesn't seem to really play out like that. The blood lactate does seem to clear faster. Active recovery also seems to clear blood lactate faster, but it doesn't actually recover you faster in the sense that when you go back to your activities, your performance is enhanced. All groups generally remain very, very similar. So would this be useful in between sessions? Realistically, he's not going to do his conditioning session in the morning, then do some active recovery, maybe sitting on a bike to clear that blood lactate. So this probably makes sense in the fact that it's just going to force him to sit down, relax for a while between his training sessions. I certainly don't think there's any negative impact on this. I haven't seen any reason to think that, and certainly none of the research would suggest that there's any negative impact on the adaptation process if we're clearing that blood lactate faster. It's just that we need to be careful in thinking, what is this going to do for subsequent training sessions? And then you need to be careful in thinking, how will this impact your subsequent training session and your decisions around that? So you might think, I'm going to be more recovered, so I'm going to train harder this week because I've gotten in a session with those boots, pneumatic boots. But that doesn't really seem to be the case. However, here, again, we're always looking at how does the athlete feel? What do they get from this? Do they feel more recovered for later? Because that's a very important aspect. And we talked about this last week, in that recovery isn't always something that's going to condense your capacity to super compensate and you be even more recovered and you've progressed beyond where you would have been. Oftentimes we're looking at what makes me feel the best when I'm training, what makes me feel good in between sessions. And if something like these boots do work, then that's fantastic. If you have the option to use those, obviously they're quite expensive. Now, they might have other aspects, clinical uses in terms of lymphatic drainage, which could be useful clinically, but that's outside the scope of S&C for the most part. So when we're looking at this session, we're looking at an elite athlete, needs to sit down for a while. It's going to give him possibly some benefit to clearance of blood lactate, which might make him feel better for his subsequent sessions, and as a result then could be a useful tool. Will that be useful for you? It depends on your resources, what you're doing in your training session, and what you need to get out of those. Okay, first up, we've got the iron neck, or I believe that product is called. Certainly a way of training your neck, and they're really useful. It's often, what you probably can't see there in the camera is that there's something pulling his neck back, and he's trying to keep his neck in a strong position. Neck training for concussions, not being knocked out, resilience to that, incredibly important. Might even be useful in a scenario where you're being choked. may or may not be useful. It depends on, some people find that neck training actually helps them last a little bit longer. You know, if someone is compression on their neck, if they've got a particular submission on, some people find that it helps them last a little bit longer if they train their neck. This is probably an individual aspect, but certainly when it comes to the evidence based on reducing concussions or possibly even not getting concussed or reducing the impact of those concussions, having more lean mass in your neck is really important. The key word there is lean mass. From what it seems, the research, it's not a bigger neck, it's more muscle in your neck as opposed to more fat, which seems like more fat actually might make it worse. So train your neck, whatever fashion you want to do it. It's a really interesting aspect because the neck training is something that can be a little bit scary. If we look at some of the exercises like we might have seen someone like Mike Tyson do, or boxers or wrestlers, it's pretty wild and extreme. It's definitely something you want to work up to. But something like this, where it's a little bit more controlled environment, certainly when you're trying to maintain a static position, is definitely a good idea. Maybe moving through those full range of motion really aggressively mightn't be the best aspect, but something like this where he's trying to maintain his posture and his head position while training his neck might be a little bit more of a safer induction to neck training if you haven't done much of it before. Okay, next we've got some post-activation potentiation or PAP training. This is something that rose to prominence in the kind of early 2000s, where people discovered that if you lift a heavy load, for example, if you do a heavy back squat, usually about 80% plus, then immediately or in a short time frame after, go into a vertical jump or power activity, generally we'll see that the power activity has higher results than if you hadn't done that. So in this case, you've got box jumps and then into a vertical jump, repeated effort on the mat. Now, in those cases, this is something that probably makes sense in this scenario. So if we're into our training block, if we're coming close to a fight, if we're 5-6 weeks left, we want to maintain conditioning and probably prioritize it, but we also want to do our best to maintain power output. He's not going to be building strength here. This is way too close to a fight to be doing 5 sets of 5 or sets of 8 or 10 or high volume strength training. It's too late. That's too much stress in the system. He's probably cutting weight. He is under a lot of duress doing his sport specific activities. So here he's not going to be able to push his strength training. This would likely lead to injury, but also more importantly and probably more likely is that is also going to lead to a deterioration of his skill during these activities because it's going to fatigue him too much. It's probably going to make him feel a little bit tired. He might feel a little bit tighter, and that is definitely not what he wants. It's too late to build strength now. Really what we're trying to do here is maintain it, and then if possible increase or get more specific with our power output, which what is he is doing here. He's doing his box squats and then he's immediately moving into his vertical jump, which is a pretty common method that we'll see a lot of people using. Now he said 57 centimeters, I think, which is about 20 inches. And I think that brings up an interesting topic in regards to vertical jump height among elite athletes. So if we were to look at the best ever vertical jump, I think it's like 47 inches from an NFL athlete. And then if we look at something in the 20s, you might be forgiven for assuming that anything 20 inches or more isn't very good. This is not the case. This is not what we see. If we, outside of a few specific athletes, if you get anything close to 30 inches, if you ever hit 30 inches on a vertical jump, even for elite athletes, you are doing incredibly well. It's a really good jump. Now, I know in this scenario he's hitting 20 inches or whatever. That's a very good representation of what you'd expect from an elite athlete like this. Yes, there's NFL athletes and possibly NBA athletes who are jumping 40 plus inches, but that is just not the representation we see across the elite athlete spectrum. A 30-inch vertical jump is phenomenal. It's also something you don't need to be necessarily obsessed with. If you're very low on that aspect, if you were 15, 17 inches, then we'd probably be a little bit concerned about your power output. Could you do anything about it now? Probably not. It's likely this number is slightly reduced as well because he's probably fatigued, and if he was fresher and hadn't done a conditioning session that morning, there's probably a couple of extra inches there, which would be a good indicator of where he's at power-wise. But if you get anything into the mid 20 inches or plus with your vertical jumping, you're doing a great job, and this is something we've seen a lot with athletes. So don't be construed by jumpflation from the extreme outliers. For most athletes who aren't fully in the realm where all their training is forced towards a specific activity that might increase their vertical jump, for other aspects, for other athletes who are training other sports, 25 plus in our experience, it's a good vertical jump for sure. Okay, so to finish off then, we've got a series of what we would call assistance exercises. We've got things like peel-off press, we've got some split squats on a flywheel, and then we've got some single arm rows, all of which are great exercises to do. So again, in this scenario, what you're going to be looking at here is what's going to fatigue him, what does he need to be doing, what do we want to try and maintain as best as possible, how much muscle mass can we kind of signal to maintain to that system, how much strength can we try and maintain without interfering with the rest of his training, certainly when he's a couple of weeks out. And unilateral work, where isolating certain things is really useful. The split squats on the flywheel is an interesting option. It's probably a faster way of getting to fatigue without doing a whole lot of volume, which might make sense in this scenario. Then we've got those single arm rows, which are a great exercise, obviously. You can see he's trying to do these quite explosively. And I like this attitude that athletes bring to their S&C, especially if you're a fighter. I like the idea and the intention behind trying to do things as quickly as possible and as explosively as possible. And as long as we're adhering to a progressive program, if we're in that phase, doing things with good technique and as fast as possible, I think is generally a good habit for a lot of athletes, certainly if that exercise makes sense. So in this scenario, if he feels like he's in a good position to pull on that single arm row as quickly as possible, that single arm lat pull down, whatever you want to call it, then I think that's quite interesting. I think that's quite a good idea that athletes should possibly look at. You know, if you're doing your box squats or your squats, this is just general intention, trying to move heavy weights or heavy resisted exercises as fast as possible, I think is beneficial for a lot of athletes. The intention behind how you do these things, while somewhat intangible, I think is really beneficial, and it does transfer over to the sport. The more you repeat that activity, the more you repeat that attribute that you want, which is explosive and fast, as long as you're still adhering to your program and progressing, I think it's a great idea. So by and large, pretty interesting training here from Israel Adesanya. Whether he'll win his fight or not, it remains to be seen, but certainly great to see videos like this, and hopefully more fighters keep this up so we can have a look at what they're doing. If you want more information like this, sign up to the Sika Strength newsletter in the Strength and Conditioning section. We'll get a lot more information like this. Newsletters created by Dara and I. Or if you'd like more programs like this, if you'd like to follow something from us, check out Sika Strength app on iOS and Android.